Welcome to 7:30. This Saturday, Australians will vote on whether to change the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia through a voice to Parliament. The journey to constitutional recognition began with bipartisan support in 2007. It continued during Labor and Liberal governments, with the idea of a voice to Parliament emerging from Indigenous peoples in 2017. Late last year, as the Prime Minister pushed the referendum forward, constitutional recognition as a political project lost its bipartisan embrace, becoming a fiercely argued debate, which now meets its test. We begin our nationwide coverage tonight in Tasmania, a state viewed by both sides as crucial to their chances of winning. Will Murray reports.
It is evident to me that this elite proposal is about division.
It was in Tasmania the No campaign was officially launched.
No more division. We are out there to crush this division.
Since then, the campaigning here hasn't stopped.
We need to do something different and to do something better.
Tasmania is seen by both sides as a state that could go either way. Few polls are taken in Tasmania, and those that are typically have very small samples and much bigger margins of error than other states. However, in those polls, Tasmania has consistently maintained one of the strongest yes votes in the country.
The polling that really matters in any state, in any territory, is the one on Saturday.
Palawa woman Alison Overeem has been part of the Yes campaign in Tasmania since it began.
Let's show the rest of Australia that Tassie rocks the yes.
Regardless of the result, she says the voice debate has led to many meaningful discussions about Aboriginal issues and history in the state.
Most people who went to school in the 50s, 60s and 70s were told there were no Tasmanian Aboriginal people. I've seen many more people want to know more about what happened here.
Aboriginal people in Uluru, Tasmania were decimated to only 50 surviving Aborigines at one stage. For 220 years now, in many different forms, Tasmania has attempted to deny even the existence of Aboriginal people in an attempt to not have to deal with the rights that Aboriginal people have in this state.
Today, Tasmanian Aboriginal people are overrepresented in adult prisons, youth detention and in out-of-home care.
I went to far too many COAG meetings where we heard that whatever we were doing wasn't closing the gap.
Will Hodgman is one of 5 former premiers of Tasmania who support the yes vote, as does the state's current Liberal Premier, Jeremy Rockliff. They've argued new solutions to persistent problems must be found.
We've had advisory bodies advising government about closing the gap for 14 years now. It's not an issue of the government not having enough advice from Aboriginal people. The issue here is that the government aren't willing to listen to the advice or act on that advice.
While many of Tasmania's most powerful current and former politicians support the voice, influential Aboriginal groups do not.
This is not going to see any land returned. This is not going to help incarceration rates. It's not going to support Aboriginal sovereignty or self-determination. So we say no. We want what was stolen from us, and that was certainly not an advisory body.
At the outset of the referendum campaign, South Australia was considered a key battleground. In June, the state government put plans for its own voice to Parliament on hold until the federal referendum is completed. Our correspondent Evelyn Leckie joins us now from Adelaide. Welcome, Evelyn. Now, the Yes campaign chose Adelaide for its launch. How have the campaigns unfolded since then?
Well, Sarah, both sides of the campaign have been spending a lot of time here in South Australia, and that's because this state is so crucial to the end result. Now, Yes supporters have made it clear from the beginning that the pathway to victory is through South Australia. And Voice supporters had hoped from the beginning that South Australia's history in progressive Indigenous law reform could help push that campaign along. And then we've also got the current Voice to Parliament that's being established next year. So they hope that campaign would help push it along. But polling has indicated recently that there's been quite a dramatic fall for the yes support here in South Australia.
Now, Evelyn, South Australia's plans for a legislated assembly, for a legislated state voice rather, it was described as a beacon of hope, I think, by Noel Pearson. Tell me, what has been the impact of that not going ahead?
That's right, Sarah. It was meant to be in operation now before the national referendum, and the South Australian government conceded that it wasn't the right time to be having these discussions at the same time as a national referendum. It was leading to confusion and distraction for SA voters. So ultimately that could have hurt the Yes campaign here. And interestingly, if we do end up with a no result on Saturday, that could bring more questions forward in relation to the state voice to Parliament going forward.
Has it been obvious to you what the cut-through arguments have been during the campaign?
Well, there's been a real mixed bag. I was out in Port Lincoln with the Prime Minister earlier, and there seemed to be a lot of confusion there from the locals of what the voice would mean. It really has been a real mixed bag here in South Australia, so you can see why the Prime Minister was out there campaigning hard in the outer and regional areas, because there appears to be a little bit more confusion about what the voice will mean for Indigenous Australians.
And briefly, from the no side, how powerfully has their campaign resonated in South Australia?
I'd say it's been quite powerful, Sarah. As I mentioned, it's the outer suburbs and regional SA that appear that the no campaign has gained some traction. If you look at the seat of Grey, where the Prime Minister was there earlier, I saw a poll 29.7% in support of yes over there. So it has definitely gained a lot of traction in its campaigning.
Evelyn Leckie, thank you very much for joining us from Adelaide this evening. Campaigners from both sides in New South Wales are in a last-minute dash to convince undecided voters among Sydney's culturally diverse electorates. But some are worried about the effect of misinformation in the final days of the campaign. Jason On reports.
Upbeat and buoyant, the Yes campaign remains defiant despite the polls.
This can be won, we can get there.
If you don't know, vote no. What a stupid, nonsensical slogan.
Australian Local Hero of the Year Amar Singh is back in Sydney after a national road trip for the Yes side.
This is the time to give a fair go to our First Nations people, so please vote. Yes! Thank you.
How many people do you think you've spoken to?
We'll have to be in the thousands and thousands.
The Western Sydney resident has been rallying culturally diverse communities who he worries have been misled by false ideas.
We've come across many undecided voters. Many of them have been fed this misinformation about your land being taken, about you being made to rebuy your houses from the Indigenous land councils, about interest rates going up.
Misinformation that's accessible and really rife in some areas of the community is just muddying the waters. And that ultimately is a poor outcome for democracy and it's a poor outcome for the nation.
A former reality TV contestant, Steve Coe, has joined the No cause.
The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Hey champions, I'm coming after you, one by one, and you don't know it.
Trying to persuade voters among Sydney's Asian communities.
If you don't know, understand more, talk to Stevie, right? I'll tell you what it's all about, and then you can vote no. We ought to be treated equally. The inequality is when the Aboriginal community will have that extra representation through the advisory body, which we don't.
If Australia is an equal society, what needs to be done about closing the gap?
Well, to close the gap, it can be better done other than The Voice.
At this early voting centre in Sydney's northwest, The Voice had some support.
Which way did you vote?
Yes. Yes.
And why was that?
Everybody deserves a voice.
Yep. Doesn't matter who you are, mate.
Anything that will close the gap.
But what happens beyond Saturday is unknown. Some from the no side agree that Australia will need to do more to help Indigenous Australians, even without a voice.
15th October morning or 16th morning, we all need to come together and see what are the learnings from this, and we need to do the betterment for the Indigenous communities.
It's from the Northern Territory at Uluru that the idea of a voice to Parliament was formally presented to the Australian community. About 30% of the Northern Territory's population is Indigenous. Our reporter Isabella Tolhurst is in Darwin. Isabella, welcome. You've had to cover an enormous geographic area in your reporting on The Voice. How have the campaigns been resonating?
Sarah, the campaign has certainly been unique in the Northern Territory. We've heard for months that in remote communities they haven't heard of The Voice and aren't getting the information that they need. That has changed in recent weeks due to the work of land councils and organisations who work in and with communities. They've done a good job at sharing information. They, along with volunteers as well, have been sharing information, but often it's one-sided. We went to the APY lands in Central Australia where Yes campaigners were practically on tour with the AEC, where they were setting up to conduct their polling in remote communities, and they were the only campaigners in those towns. So the influence that they've had over remote voting will be interesting to see on Saturday. On top of that, it's been challenging getting the word out to remote communities that polling is taking place. In Nuku, where we were a couple of weeks ago, the AEC was set up, ready to go, but the community didn't know they were there, so campaigners got in their cars and gathered people to come and vote. So it'll be interesting to see the ongoing impacts of the lack of information in this referendum.
Now, also at the same time in the Territory, you've got one of the most prominent no campaigners, Jacinta Price. What kind of impact has she had in the campaign, do you think?
Jacinta Price is a large voice. She is controversial both around the country and here in the Territory, but the campaign has really been led by community volunteers. People in communities have been going out and campaigning, as I said. We've also had presence from Yes campaigners like Dean Parkin and Rachel Perkins here in Darwin and Alice Springs. Haven't seen quite the same level of engagement from their counterparts like Warren Mundine, but Jacinta Price has certainly been heard all around the country on this matter.
And what do you think the cut-through ideas have been in the Territory? Given there's a relatively, in terms of the proportion, a large number of Indigenous people, what have been the cut-through ideas in the campaign?
Well, the ABC Northern Territory team have travelled far and wide around the Territory, gauging public opinion from Indigenous communities as well. One of the things that The Voice has promised to do is to help close the gap. And here in the Northern Territory and remote communities, that gap is glaringly evident. We spoke to Lisa Mumbin, who is from a town near Katherine. She's a Jawoyn elder. She hopes that the Voice may help close the gap in things like health outcomes, incarceration rates, housing accessibility. They're all issues that her community and other communities around the Territory are experiencing. On top of that, there's also the matter that the Northern Territory feels a long way away from Canberra, where policies are made, and so it's hoped by a lot of communities that The Voice may provide a more direct line of communication between remote communities and Canberra. But then other communities like Nuku, where we have visited, say that they would rather speak directly to elected government officials rather than go through a voice that may not pass on the message directly how they want it to be passed on. So there's a real varied response. But the Northern Territory has been the centre of these discussions despite not having a lot of swaying power. But it will be interesting to see, I think, the Northern Territory, if The Voice is successful. The country will look to the Territory to gauge whether or not it is working. And if The Voice doesn't get up, the Northern Territory will be a pressing reminder to politicians and the public that change still is needed for these remote communities, whether it's through a voice or not.
Isabel Tolhurst, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Western Australia is home to the most comprehensive native title agreement secured in Australia with the Noongar people. But it's also the state with the highest rate of Indigenous incarceration in the country and an overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in custody at its now notorious youth detention centre. One of the questions for Saturday's vote is whether a majority of West Australians believe the voice could lead to real change. Rhiannon Shine reports.
Cottesloe, home to billionaires and beautiful beaches.
Good morning. Do you want some information about the voice?
It seems many here have already made up their minds.
No, okay, thank you.
Very good.
Just 0.7% of the Curtin electorate identify as Indigenous, but local independent MP Kate Chaney hopes her constituents will support it.
Well, there are a lot of different polls, but there's only one that matters, and that's on the 14th of October.
Those ones are good. Nice fact.
Her uncle, Fred Chaney, was once the Minister for Indigenous Affairs in a federal Liberal government. But he's not impressed with the way his old party has approached this debate.
I think they've approached it primarily as a game of political advantage, bloodying the Prime Minister's nose as the primary objective. I think that's a mistake. This is a national interest question.
Hundreds of kilometres from Cottesloe Beach is the gold mining town of Kalgoorlie-Boulder. Here, the Indigenous population is 7.7%.
Affluent twits in the city, you know, love Aboriginal people. Never met any, but they love them, and they think this will help.
Graham Campbell was the federal member for Kalgoorlie in the 80s. He says he's hearing a lot of support for the no side, including from Aboriginal people.
Any advancement is very, very slow because the money never gets down to where it's needed. And they know that if the yes vote gets up, it'll just be more of the same.
Have a great day. Same to you. Good morning. Hello. Hi. Hello. Some of the mob coming through.
Wongatha woman and Kalgoorlie local Shaneen Weldon believes the voice could help with the various challenges in her community.
Housing, health, the over-representation of the justice system.
But after manning the pre-polling booth all week, a yes result feels distant.
People who just refuse to look at us and make fun of the signs or our ballot paper.
Back in Perth, social justice advocate Megan Cracker is going to check in on a family in need.
It is a poverty narrative. She's a very kind lady.
Earlier this year, she announced her opposition to the voice. Now, she's decided to vote yes. Was there a particular moment that made you change your mind?
There was 2 suicides that really affected me to the point where I thought, I can't do this. There has to be some way forward. If we say no, what do we have after that point?
Hello, how are you? What's going on?
The family Megan is visiting today is contemplating what difference a voice would make to their lives.
Look how fat this kid is.
Jade has recently become a grandmother. Her children, Stanley and Brianna, were taken away from her when they were young and grew up in state care.
I moved into like 30 different houses, stressful. So I don't really want no one else to go through that, you know, just...
Do you think the voice could help?
A bit, I reckon, yeah.
I feel like it's going to give him more opportunities for the future, hoping it will make it easier for him instead of having it to the struggle like what I did. And I'm hoping the voice could do that for not only him but all of our future children, because we really do need that.
In Victoria, a First Peoples Assembly has already been established which represents Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in that state. That means whatever the outcome of the national referendum, Victoria is already working towards a treaty. Our reporter Nadia Daly joins us from Melbourne. Nadia, at the outset, Victoria registered, I think, the highest support for the voice. Has that shifted during the campaign?
Yes, well, Sarah, Victoria is often seen as one of the more progressive states on a range of issues, including Indigenous affairs. And At the same time, we've seen great division in this state. You know, fringe neo-Nazi groups making very public displays that we haven't seen to the same extent in other parts of the country. But in Victoria, we have the First Peoples Assembly, a democratically elected body that represents Indigenous people in the country, and we're on track, like you said, to be one of the first states to begin treaty negotiations next year. So there's diverse views here, but the state has already made progress on Indigenous affairs.
So Nadia, with that very fierce kind of push-pull in the debate that's been going on, are you able to tell us what issues it is people have been talking about, what it is they want to change?
We have seen a number of high-profile Victorians come out and say which way they'll be voting. We've seen Collingwood Football Club's captain Darcy Moore say he'll be voting yes. Of course, Lydia Thorpe has been one of the more vocal Victorians on the no side, part of the progressive no campaign and the Black Sovereign movement. So that movement and Lydia Thorpe, they're against the voice, but for steps like treaty. Lydia Thorpe said she has been targeted by neo-Nazis as a result of her views on this campaign. Today, I've been speaking more broadly to members of the Yes and No campaign, and both those sides say, the no side is quite happy because, as you mentioned before, the tide is shifting in Victoria, with the polling showing that it's now looking like the no vote is going to win, and they say it feels like a done deal, but the yes side says it's not over yet, and they're still campaigning and hoping to sway some of the undecided voters in the coming days. So it's really getting to crunch time in Victoria. Speaking to the First Peoples Assembly, some of their members out campaigning have been subjected to racial abuse. So it shows how heated the campaign is becoming here in Victoria.
Nadia, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now to Queensland, a state that's projected to reject the voice. In the small former mission town of Cherbourg, 3 hours from Brisbane, some Aboriginal leaders feared that result would set their community back even further. Others never wanted the voice at all. Stephanie Zillman has this story.
The yes vote gets up, it's a glimmer of hope, and I've always been taught that hope will always overcome hurt.
Uncle Eric Law has lived a life of service to his community. A Vietnam veteran, retired teacher, mayor, Murray Court magistrate, now guide of Cherbourg's Ration Shed Museum.
I've always been a strong yes voter because I think that's the only way for us First Nations people. I think if the no vote gets up, nothing happens, nothing changes in our community.
First Nations leaders of this community are frustrated at wasted government spending and duplication of services.
This community is very well equipped with organisations and services, and I think the biggest problem is that they're not coordinated.
We should be thriving. Accountability at the end of the day. Everyone, gets paid to do a job, deliver a service, do it. It's not hard. And work together as a team. You have better outcomes then.
Cherbourg Aboriginal Shire Council takes on many projects not usually done by local government, from employment training to a health board.
Ideas for fundraisers?
Yeah, that'll be good.
All of that.
Well, just one thing I want to mention is that waiting shed at the front. Yeah.
Myself and 4 other councillors are on that board, and we also got 2 community members that sit on that board. And, we want to make the right decision.
Elvie Sando believes her council is already an elected voice.
I'm voting no, because I think government is just reinventing the wheel, and it hasn't worked. And, governments keep going down the same track. Closing the gap is another classic example. Closing the gap's not working in my community, the gap's actually widening.
Cherbourg has around 1,200 people. Preventable diseases like diabetes are 3 times the rate of mainstream Australia. The town has been deeply traumatised by suicide, but grassroots programs are making a difference.
It's out in the open and families are talking about it. They are asking for help, and more often than not it's coming from each other.
Leaders here say no matter the outcome, they will continue to empower their community to speak up.
They are valued, they are important, they are relevant, and it's important that, you know, our voices are heard. And I just cross fingers that, well, I believe we need that, yes.
All I want from Australians to do on Saturday is to walk into that ballot box, not as a Liberal Party member, not as a Labor Party member, but as an Australian, and say to themselves, is this a fair thing for Australia?
As we said at the beginning, recognition has been a long and involved debate in Australia. While Indigenous leaders argued passionately that they were presenting an argument to the Australian people, the debate was shaped in the political realm, and much is at stake for our politicians. Let's bring in our chief political correspondent, Laura Tingle. Laura, welcome. Let's start with your reflections on the campaign.
Well, I think we've got another 48 hours to go. The Yes camp are saying that, you know, they're holding out hope. They know that the figures aren't looking good, but they're saying that they've detected a bit more positive support for themselves in the last few days, and they're suggesting that the No camp has disappeared out of sight for that reason. Now, we shall have to wait and see what happens on Saturday, but it's not been an attractive campaign.
Of all the arguments, if you had to boil it down, what do you think has been the most cut-through argument?
This idea that it's going to divide the country by race, that that it's going to be inserting some sort of new racial divide in the Constitution. And in the process of focusing on things like this, the arguments about why we're trying to do this in the first place, what the reflections are on our history, have all been lost. Nobody's really thinking about why we are trying to recognise people, or why we might have to recognise people.
Is there a chasm between what we have seen and how the arguments have been made in Canberra in the political arena and what's been happening with smaller scale individual arguments out and about away from politics?
I don't think that's necessarily been the chasm. I think the chasm has been more that, and I think this has got very disturbing signals for the way politics could be conducted in the future. There's been, shall we say, the mainstream arguments, then there's been a completely different campaign in social media, which I think has often overwhelmed things, and I think that's something that we don't really know how to come to terms with either. I don't think politicians know how to come to terms with that, and I don't think the media does either, the so-called mainstream media. And so it's ended up with a lot of rabbits running down holes, being hotly pursued by all sorts of people, the whole thing getting out of control and very little coherence in the argument.
And what about individuals, for you, who have been the standout performers during the campaign up to today?
Well, I think one of the factors here is on both the yes and no sides, we've got a lot of sort of disruption and disunity. There are different camps in the yes case, different camps in the no case. Without a doubt, the power of the black on black warfare, if you like, the fact that Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price and Lydia Thorpe have been out there arguing the no case has been a really good reason for a lot of white people to say, well, they don't even agree, so why should we? I think so that makes particularly Senator Price a really lethal political weapon during this campaign. I think the interesting thing on the yes side is it's been people who haven't really been at the centre in a way of that Uluru Statement as such, like Rachel Perkins, who've really come through as really articulate advocates for this case.
Now, clearly this started, I don't mean constitutional recognition, I mean this referendum began as a very powerful political moment for Anthony Albanese. What's at stake politically now as we go towards Saturday?
Well, I suppose what's at stake is that it really will take paint. It has taken paint off the Prime Minister and off Labor. It's consumed a lot of their political capital. But I think the real political issue now is what on earth we do. I don't think we decide that till we see what the result is, but it's not tenable that we do nothing, not necessarily just on recognition, but on addressing Indigenous disadvantage. As somebody has said this week, we're living in the no case now. So if the result is no, we already know what it looks like. But I don't think it's necessarily going to do any good for Peter Dutton if the no case wins in the long term. But it does, I think the political implications is that it will fire up the Conservatives to think that this is the way you run politics, and I think that's a really deeply disturbing sign for the country. It's a further push into this idea that you just attack, you just tear down, and that you have nothing positive to say about virtually anything.
Laura Tingle, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah.
The yes side in this referendum want the voice to be a permanent form of direct engagement with the government for Indigenous people. A no vote would be a profound setback to those Indigenous leaders who put their faith in a process they believed would bring the country closer to reconciliation of past injustice. In the event of victory for the no side, there'll be much to say about how their campaign was so forcefully led by two Indigenous leaders. Whichever way the vote goes, our politicians will be tasked with uniting Australia after the campaign. Good night.